It's Tuesday morning, which means I'm not exactly walking upright yet because Monday night is my basketball night. And I'm not that young, but my squad did dominate, I'm happy to report. Which doesn't mean we won every game, but we won the last game, and economists will tell you that while the average described, the margin predicts. So there you go. That's a little bit of spin, but that's the only spin you'll hear today. Let me just make sure I got this baby running. Beautiful, thank you. Thank you, Ed Lazier, who's here, for inviting me. And I'm really excited to be talking to this group today. You know, I've always been told, I don't know if this is true because I don't really know anything about the Japanese language, but I've always been told that the word crisis in Japanese is the same word for opportunity. And I certainly know, I carry a black belt in karate, and I certainly know that a key concept of karate is that, another Japanese word, is that a threat, when your opponent is most vulnerable to a counterpunch, is when he's attacking you. By the way, that thing about a black belt, that's an alternative fact. So I just want to I can do that now, right? That's okay. As long as you say it's an alternative fact. So how do we understand the nature of the Trump threat? How do we mold this crisis into an opportunity? It's challenging, I think, the threat from Trump and Trumpism, because I don't believe much of what he says, which doesn't mean he isn't going to do some of what he says, as we've seen. But you know, when Trump says, I'm going to do something on Monday, he can easily say he's not going to do it on Tuesday. But even though you can't believe what he says, you can still know what he's up to, and I know what he's up to. I mean, I'm here to tell you, I've been studying these knuckleheads for 30 years, and nothing I'm seeing surprises me. I got a PhD in Paul Ryan, I got a PhD in Mitch McConnell, I got a PhD in Donald Trump. So, you know, there's nobody fooling me, and I suspect you as well. So, you know, we're not idiots, step one. Point two, at CBPP, and I know CBPP is in the house today, so hello to all my friends from work. We tend to work on national economic issues, and I recognize we're here to talk about the DC context today. But these national economic and political issues are obviously critical contexts. We were just talking earlier about that, the impact of the DC budget, of the federal budget on DC food programs. And it's in that context in which much of your work takes place, so I won't be at all shy in my next 15 minutes or so going through what I see are the largest threats and constraints from the national scene. And by the way, I'm going to talk for about 15, 20 minutes, and then we're going to have ample time for Q&A, or when I used to work for the White House, what we called questions and evasions, but now we'll do questions and answers. So we have serious threats to our national policies, from healthcare to the environment to anti-poverty policies to tax policies and much more. I'll say more about that in the context of my talk. But DC has a tremendous asset, which I'll show you in a moment. In fact, it's in this room, but not all of it's here, and I'll show you that asset in a second. And I think the key point is that progressives have been activated and awakened, maybe in some ways awakened from a kind of a bit of a, I don't want to say sleep is too strong a word, but activated in a way that I think is ultimately going to be helpful if we can craft, frame, and sell a robust and compelling agenda that not only fights the forces of inequality, but in a way that actually excites people. And here's where I begin. This is the percentage of voters who rejected Donald Trump by selected counties and cities across the country, and as you see, DC is up there at 96%. Now, I'd like to find out who those 4% are, have a little talk with them. Now, this is a tremendous asset. And an asset is something that can be used and tapped to great effect or not, or ignored. And I submit to you that learning how to most effectively work that asset is one of the most important goals that I believe progressives have, not just in this city. Of course, it's important for families in the district, and it's essential for this kind of public policy that many of the people in the room represent, to push back on the challenges that so many families face here. So I'm not saying all is national versus all is local. I think there's a hybrid that I'm trying to talk about here today. I mean, when we're talking about the district, we know of the challenges we face in education and jobs and childcare, just trying to raise healthy kids amidst an infrastructure that's often failing. And I don't just mean a policy infrastructure or an economic infrastructure. I'm actually talking about an actual infrastructure. And if you read the front page of today's Washington Post about the kid who got lead poisoning in DC housing there, you'll understand what I'm talking about. Environmental threats, these are all both local and national threats that we have to be mindful of. But that's just part of the equation that I'm contemplating today. I'm thinking about something much, much bigger for this talk, for this meeting, at least my part. I'm thinking about the progressive agenda that the next Democrat will run on. And I think that the DC asset, that big bar there at the left end of this chart, is the asset that will help us not only craft that agenda, but sell it. Now, I thought that Hillary Clinton actually had a pretty strong progressive platform. She herself argued that she's not great at retail politics, but I'm not going to diss her. She should have won, and in fact, she did win the majority vote by 3 million votes. But those of us who care about reducing the barriers to opportunity that inequality has put up, about returning more bargaining clout to working people, about protecting the gains that we made, we must be thinking not just about our own backyard, which is, I think, much the theme of the meeting today, but the backyard of those with whom we should be in solidarity. This includes low-wage workers, and one of the most impressive fights we've waged here in this city is the Great Fight for 15, not to mention the paid family medical leave, the Universal Paid Leave Act, which, by the way, replaces 90% of the wage for the lowest wage workers so they can actually afford to take advantage of the policy once it becomes law. So that was actually a very thoughtful kind of wonky crafting policy piece of that. It also, okay, some person under 30 come up here and help me. Oh, there we go. I dropped the water bottle on the computer. Oops. It also includes the median worker. What I'm talking about now is the constituency that I believe this asset, this 96% asset, needs to think about uniting in solidarity. The median, this graph shows the growing gap between productivity growth, or output in the economy, output per hour actually, and the hourly compensation of the median or the worker right in the middle of the wage scale at the 50th percentile. And I think it's a revealing way of looking at the inequality problem and one of the underlying structural deficiencies in today's economy. As you see, if you go back to the 50s and 60s, median compensation tracked productivity. In fact, they both just about doubled. This is indexed to 100 in about 1975 or 6 or something. And so you see that both of those variables doubled. They grew right together in pace. But since then, productivity is up about 73%, and hourly compensation is up about 11%. And that gap means that the typical worker, the median worker, and not just their wage, but their compensation, is simply not claiming their fair share of the productivity growth as used to be the case. This includes, again, this group with whom I believe we need to embrace solidarity includes people who definitely aren't in this room, and that's folks whose political and economic fortunes played a very important and elevated role in this election, and that's people in the manufacturing sector, particularly displaced workers in the Rust Belt. That's not what you see here. What you see here is actually a graph of the pay. The blue line is the pay of factory workers, blue-collar manufacturing workers, again, their compensation, going back to the 1940s all the way up to today. The other line, by the way, is the trade deficit, the extent to which we are importing more than we're exporting. So these are I put this in here because these discussions are so much in the news and I think played a critical role in the election upset. And in fact, the wage of the blue-collar manufacturing worker doubled from the late 40s to the late 70s, went from about $12 in today's dollars to about 24. And it's just been flat ever since. Now contemplate that for a second. I'm not talking about the people who lost their jobs. I'm talking about people who are working in the manufacturing sector. And those folks haven't seen much of a raise in 35 years, despite when I argue with my fellow economists in the punditry about that, they're always saying, well, the thing that's hurt manufacturing employment has been productivity growth. Okay, I think that's part of it, no question. But clearly, productivity growth that is supposedly boosting the sector doesn't explain flat wage trends like this. So something else is going on. Part of it is the trade deficit, but part of it is many of the factors that have suppressed not just the median compensation, but this wage as well. Now, many progressives, and especially people of color, have legitimate concerns about solidarity with some in the working class who, following the lead of divisive and race-baiting politicians like Trump, want to demonize them. And I think there may be some in the audience legitimately asking, how can we join forces with racists or with those who discriminate against immigrants, women, Muslims? And the answer is that we cannot. But it is a very, very old trick of those who have a lot to get those who don't have much to spend all their time and energy fighting with each other. And I'm an economist. I was taught to think in terms of models that emphasize skills and supply and prices and interest rates and tax policies and budgets and all the stuff we noodle over at the Center on Budget. And that's fine. That's as it should be. As was said, we want to bring knowledge to this debate. We're going to bring facts to a world that is not welcoming them right now. But, at the heart of my model is definitely factual analysis, but right next to it is this one little word with 5 little letters, and that's power. That's power. The numbers I showed you at the very beginning of this talk, those numbers represent power. The vast majority of people in this city, at least by this one simple metric, suggest to me that D.C. is a bastion of rationality in a country that's seeing far too little of that these days. This is the city on the hill, if I want to get Reagan-esque about it. And not only do we have the right ideas, but you've shown, and I've watched you, I've tried to help Ed a little bit at the edges, but you've shown we know how to take them from the idea stage to the policy brief, through to the political organizing, to getting them over the legislative goal line. And that skill that's embodied in this room, the Fiscal Policy Institute and all those groups that were listed at the beginning of the talk, that skill combined with that asset, combined with these deficits, with these wage deficits, with the income deficits, with the power deficits, in my case, I'm interested in the trade deficit, the combination of that policy acumen, that political acumen, the 96% progressive vote there, I believe if properly harnessed, that can be incredibly powerful, and not just here, as I said, but more broadly. Now, D.C. ain't Kansas, I get that. But I picked Kansas for a reason. Kansas is going through, and this is something we've worked a lot on at the center, and by the way, my colleague, coworker Ben Spielberg's here today. Ben and I have a new podcast. We just started a podcast, so if you all listen to our podcast, that would be cool for us, and maybe you'd like it too. It's called On the Economy. You can get it on iTunes, I think. And anyway, one of the first episode, we only have one episode now. We're going to go back today and work on episode 2. And in the first episode of our first and only episode of our podcast so far, we talked about this issue of trickle-down supply-side tax cuts, which is so germane to today's conversation because that's what's coming from the Trump administration. But before Trump got to town, they've been doing this trickle-down experiment. I don't know why you call it an experiment when it's been tried many times before and consistently failed. Yet I guess you would. It's a failed experiment. They've tried this in Kansas, and it has basically left their budget in shambles. Not only has economic growth not picked up to counteract the impact of the very deep tax cuts they imposed in Kansas, both on incomes and on businesses. They're losing, they're hemorrhaging revenue, and there's no growth effect to make it up because that never really comes through. These tax cuts always fail to pay for themselves or even get close to that. And Kansas conservatives are not happy. Now, there's a politics there that I'm not going to get into, and it's very different than ours, of course, so I'm not saying that simply the failure of supply-side tax cuts has defeated their governor, who actually won re-election last time he was up. But there are, the state's bond rating has been downgraded a couple of times, and people in Kansas, conservatives in Kansas, actually care a lot about stuff like education, and the budget shortfall is hurting there. So it's not a slam dunk by a long shot that our policy agenda isn't going to resonate with people outside of DC, with people who didn't post a 96, which is just about everybody else. And in fact, my argument is that it's going to resonate a lot more with people and I'm talking about people in red states and blue states. I'm talking about Republicans and Democrats and independents and working class and you name it. I believe we have the makings of a policy agenda that would resonate a lot more with those folks than the agenda that's being cooked up a few blocks from here, which involves, for example, repealing the Affordable Care Act. This is a slide that some of our tax team put together. So when you repeal the ACA, when you repeal the Affordable Care Act, one of the things you repeal is the tax cuts that help support it. And if you look at the one of the things you can do using tax data is look at the 400 richest households. So I think their average income is something like 17 million, I believe. So these are really rich households. And if you look at the tax cuts that they get from cutting the taxes that support the ACA, the tax cut for the families, those families in the top 400 wealthiest families, the tax cut amounts to almost $3 billion. I think it's a tax cut of over $1 million for each of those 400 families. And if you then compare that to the loss of the premium tax credits, so these, you know, if you're a moderate or low income person who gets the ACA, you typically get a tax credit to help you purchase health insurance in one of these exchanges. Well, if you look at the amount of tax credits that people in all the states listed there would lose, you find out that the top 400 households get tax cuts worth more, a little bit more, than the credits that 800,000 people in 20 states and DC would lose. So my point here is that this is massive Robin Hood in reverse. This is the idea where you're cutting taxes very significantly for those at the top because the ACA was supported by pretty progressive taxes, and you're raising taxes, you're taking away tax credits, which is the same as raising taxes for folks at the low end. So I argue that will not resonate with the people with whom we should be in solidarity and with the people whom those negative wage trends I showed you are affecting. Similarly, the tax cut that Trump is proposing. This is its distributional impact. So this is the percent change in the after-tax income once the Trump plan is fully phased in 10 years from now. And as you can see, the largest benefits go to the millionaire group there on the far right, and that's actually less than 1% of all households. Folks in the middle class end up with about 1%. I say folks in the middle class have their after-tax income grows by about 1%. So it's not that they get nothing, but they get very little relative to those at the top. So this again is a very regressive change to our tax code. What else is being contemplated? Well, there's already talk about extensive cuts to the spending side of the budget, in part to help avoid the kind of red ink that you're going to get when you slash taxes to this extent. And those cuts are not going to fall on defense. They say they're going to hold Social Security and Medicare harmless, or at least Trump does, but I don't believe that. And in fact, what we know they're going to go after are vulnerable programs, many of which are represented by people in this room. Typically, these fit into the non-discretionary defense side of the budget because when it comes to appropriating defense, they say they want to plus that up, and I actually believe them. But we're talking about non-defense discretionary parts of the federal budget, much of which plays out in the DC level. Rental vouchers for housing, homelessness resources, job training, money that goes to poor school districts, Head Start, Pell Grants. Those are the kinds of budget categories that will be slammed in order to try to pay for this mess. Meanwhile, there is definitely a move afoot, and here's where my PhD and Ryan and McConnell come in, because for a long time these folks have wanted to block grant some of the key safety net programs, and I'm thinking about SNAP and Medicaid. It's typically called a block grant. Sometimes they call it a per capita cap, which is a little different. But the theme of the whole thing is providing a fixed funding that is typically going to be below what these programs need to meet their eligibility criteria. Right now, if you're eligible for SNAP, for food stamps, you get SNAP or food stamps, and the same with Medicaid. But once these programs are block granted, that will no longer be the case. They won't be able to respond in a counter-cyclical fashion to recession. And if you look at what happened to TANF, you'll have a very good idea of what's going to happen to SNAP and Medicaid under a block grant. This is a Republican ploy to make it sound like you're throwing things back to the states who are somehow going to more efficiently administer these programs. In fact, they're efficiently and effectively administered right now. The whole play here, the whole ploy here, is to simply make something look flexible, what's really a deep and structural cut. So that's the agenda that's being sold. Now let's talk about the agenda that folks in this room have so successfully worked on. And let's compare these two agendas and think about how they resonate with the people who have been beset by the trends that I've shown you so far. You know, the $15 minimum wage is a great accomplishment here, adopted in 2016. But at $11.50 now, going up to $15, $5 an hour for tipped workers, which I think is too low. Let's look at the national minimum wage. That's the top graph there, the federal minimum wage, I should say. So the federal minimum wage is still well below in real terms where it was in the late 1960s. And of course, we have a much more highly educated workforce since then and a much more productive workforce since then. So there's the only rationale for keeping the minimum wage this low is if you were one of these people who were worried about its unintended consequences. But we have extensive research that shows time and again that moderate increases in the minimum wage, and most of what we've seen are moderate. I do think that 15 in some places gets out of that moderate range, but probably not here in DC. At any rate, moderate increases don't have those significant disemployment effects, at least such that there are far more beneficiaries than people hurt by that. And that's why in the bottom graph, it's an interesting story to tell. You are not alone. There are 30 states that have raised their minimum above the federal level, and lots of states and cities too. And what this graph does, it's kind of interesting. I'm colorblind, so I'm not sure what the colors are. But the line that's on the bottom, I don't know, I'll call it blue. Okay, so it's not blue. At any rate, whatever color it is, the bottom line there is the federal minimum wage in nominal dollars. So right now it's $7.25. But the other line shows the minimum wage that most people are affected by, the effective national minimum wage. And that, all it is kind of a population-weighted version of the minimum wage. So if you actually just like pluck somebody out of America and you tried to figure out what their minimum wage was today, it would be closer to $8.50 than to $7.25 because these increases have now been so pervasive across the land. So I think that's been an extremely effective movement. We talked about paid family and medical leave, and that's going to help. And I mentioned that it's particularly designed to help low-wage workers access it, and I think that's a really important innovation. Paid sick days, all employers in DC have to provide paid sick leave, and this was adopted in 2008, but expanded in 2013, and I know many folks in the room helped with that. Increased unemployment insurance benefits in 2016. The provisions that punish companies for wage theft, health care coverage for low-income residents who don't qualify for Medicaid and would otherwise be uninsured, investments to build affordable housing, a rental assistance program that kind of riffs off the federal housing choice voucher program, universal pre-K. These are programs that have been implemented here or are in train. And my point is to ask you, which one of those agendas sounds better to someone who isn't in the top 1%? Which one of those agendas, the one I described with the cuts to the ACA and the cuts to the discretionary spending, which one of those agendas versus the one I just described, the minimum wage, paid family leave, affordable housing, health care coverage, which one of those agendas sounds better to someone who isn't in the top 1%? Now, I do not underestimate our opponents. Like I said, I've been fighting these folks for decades. I know all of their tricks, plus they've got stupid money behind them. They're up now, no question, but I don't see them delivering the goods to the people who helped elect them. I see them dangling the keys a lot, look over here, not over there, getting people worked up over all kinds of BS, from inauguration crowds to alleged fraudulent voting to framing the media as the opposition party. And I'm not trivializing all of those things. I mean, Ben and I in particular, in our first podcast, talk about this problem of facts being on the run. Believe me, I'm not trivializing these key dangles. Maybe that's the wrong metaphor. But I do think that there's a lot of look over here, don't look over there, Look at the immigration ban, which is un-American, illegal, and horrific. So again, I'm not trivializing this, but let's fight about the un-American ban while we're repealing the ACA, essentially giving the even more of the economy to the top 1%, and completely failing, repealing the ACA, and completely failing to deliver on an agenda that would actually help the people that got these folks elected. And what that seems to be doing, and I'll stop here, what that seems to be doing, and this is where I'm going to actually, let me go back to my very first slide. What that seems to be doing is awakening the opposition. It is very early days, but man, people are fired up. And if you don't believe that, talk to my wife, who gets on my case for not being upset enough. People are fired up. I mean, it's early days, and it's going to be very important to stay that way. But here in the city, here in the district, we have an asset that nobody else has, right? We have a huge majority who represent what I'm calling a bastion of rationality, a bastion of people in support of economic justice, folks who understand that process of policy, of legislation, of what it takes to get from here to there, folks who understand the plight that non-whites face in today's economy, and in particularly in ways that have been amped up by a Trump administration. And you've shown, not only do you have this asset, but you've shown that you know how to use it in a local sense. What I want to urge us today to do is, along with our job of trying to do everything we can to fix our backyard, and man, our backyard needs fixing, and the people who live, the new residents of the White House a few blocks here are going to try to screw our backyard up even more. But I want us to think beyond our backyard. I want to take our 96% asset, I want to take our kick-ass agenda, and I want to work with this awakened opposition to make that not just the DC agenda, but the national agenda. Thank you very much.
Yes. Okay. Are we? Okay. I'm supposed to be kicking.
That was good.
No, I'm gonna stop now. Thank you so much. So I know we have people who have questions for Jared. I'm gonna ask you to line up, and this is one thing I'm gonna take personal privilege as the MC here. Please ask a question and not do comments. We have a lot of things that we want to get through today, so please have a question. And a brief question would be really wonderful.
Is this, this is working, right? Yeah. Do you mind if I sit down?
No, not at all.
Too bad if you do.
I'm left-handed, we'll start in that end.
Hi, is this on?
Yes.
Yeah, my question is, a couple of months ago in the New York Times, there was an article about something that I thought was very interesting going on in the Portland, Oregon City Council. And maybe you saw it. I'm wondering if you could comment on it. It caught my eyes because it seemed like it was a very effective attempt at both addressing the income inequality issue, but also in a way that raises revenue for progressive programs. And what it was a piece of legislation that, I'm looking at my notes here because I don't have this in memory, but a piece of legislation that would impose a surtax on companies whose CEOs earn more than 100 times the median pay of their rank and file workers. An interesting idea, and I was wondering if you've looked at it and if you have a view
I
of it.
remember the article. So I like that idea. I think that whenever you come up with an idea like that, you have to ask yourself, okay, that sounds good because it both pushes back on inequality, it incentivizes a cap to what we might think of as excessive pay, and it delivers, if CEOs decide to break that cap, it delivers revenue that can perhaps offset some of the problems that inequality delivers to us, which I tried to articulate in my talk a little bit. I think the thing you have to always ask yourself, though, when we're talking about these kinds of public policies, are what kind of unintended consequences might they have? And the first one that would come to mind is that, well, companies would just leave and go someplace else. And that is something to be concerned about, but a lot of the work that we've done at the center, at least, has shown that tax policies, at least, I can't speak to salary policies like this, but tax policies, which in many ways work the same way, say a very, say a high, a progressive state income tax, don't seem to drive location decisions nearly anything close to the way the opponents suggest they do. And what really matters to corporations is the kind of infrastructure that they have access to, the education, the environment, the skills of the workforce, the quality of living. So again, revenues make a difference there. So all of this kind of stadium chasing stuff tends to, not all of it, but some of the more excessive stadium chasing stuff tends to not work out very well. And so that idea might well be a good one, and the typical pushback for it, which is, we'll just go elsewhere, should be scrutinized, because much of our research suggests that, at least in the tax side, you don't see that kind of unintended consequences so much.
Hi, my name is David Schwartzman from the D.C. State Green Party. I'm glad you put us in the 96% opposition. My question regards the graph you showed of Trump's tax plan being implemented, and what's your view about D.C. and other states raising the income tax rate, leaving the same wealthy residents with the same overall tax liability? And I did a calculation, we would get over $300 million more revenue a year. So what, Stephen Pearlstein supports this idea. What's your take on it?
Let's see, if Pearlstein likes it, what does Bernstein say about it? Yeah, I understand. I'd probably defer to, this sounds like more the turf that the DC Fiscal Policy Institute would go on, so I'm not going to say more than that type of idea, much like the one you said earlier, definitely resonates with me. And I think DC, one thing we know is that inequality in DC is really, a very extreme spread between, high, middle, and low incomes here. And I think that kind of pre-tax inequality ought to be offset with a very progressive tax structure. And in fact, what you're suggesting is very much in the theme of what my talk was. We don't have the keys to the federal car. We have the keys to the more local one. And I think anything that we can do to uplift the progressive agenda in our backyard is not only important, but it's important in showing the rest of the world what their backyards can look like too.
My name is Heather Foote. I'm with the DC Senior Advisory Coalition, which works with older adults across the city from the wealthy Ward 3 across the river, Ward 7 and 8. My question is the voice and impact on older adults in the presentation you've made. Their voice is often way underrepresented, even though they probably voted in the district by a higher percentage than 96%.
Maybe 110.
And they are, there's a lot of concern about ageism. The American Society on Aging just sent to Congress its latest volume, which is formed as a letter to the new president. I urge you to look at it, and I'd like you to speak to, in a city where there's very high senior poverty, this leads me to volunteer again this year with DC Hunger Solutions to sign people up for SNAP. Last year, probably 2/3 of the people I worked with were older adults. So the question is not the statistics on older adults. We all know the demographics here and nationally, but how can their voice be a powerful voice alongside the organizations that co-sponsored this meeting?
Let me jump in. Great question, and thank you very much for what you're doing, for your volunteering, and for raising a critical question about an important, typically politically aware, often politically aware. My mother was before she passed recently, and growing chunk of our population. So your raising that is germane, important, and I appreciate the contribution. My experience is that this is a group that doesn't need a lot of pushing to become politically energized. I would say if there's, and so I'm very much in sync with what you suggested. I think some of the issues there are preserving Social Security. I talked a little bit about the supply side tax, this big tax cut play, you know, the ACA tax, cutting the ACA taxes, which delivers, you know, billions to the very, very top. I talked about the Trump plan. Well, if you actually tote all this up, they're talking about cutting taxes to the tune of 6 or 7 trillion over a 10-year budget window. Well, you're either going to see a ton of red ink, which you're going to see, because frankly, they don't really care about budget deficits when they're in power. It's just, you know, budget deficits are a cudgel to wield against the other side when Democrats are suggesting things. It's, oh, the budget deficit, you know, give me the vapors. Now it's like, budget deficits, whatever. So I think what's going to happen there is they're going to try to force a play where in order to avoid a deep sea of red ink, they have to cut Social Security. And Trump says he won't cut Social Security, but I don't believe the things Trump says. So one area where those the folks you've mentioned have a personal interest to be energized is in preserving our social insurance programs. There is no better retirement program than Social Security. I go to these. One person agrees with me. I go to these conferences where people talk, you know, ad nauseum about all the different pension and benefit ideas that we have to invoke, and I think those are, you know, great. But let's strengthen the best one we have. So yeah, I'm with you.
So when we're thinking about protecting and advancing DC's kick-ass progressive agenda, I'm thinking of the article that was in the Post today about the DC budget oversight and how the Republicans are trying to are doing what they always do, but in part using DC as an example to show that to try to curtail such progressive agendas. And so while we're trying to lobby the DC government to be more progressive and stand up for its citizens, we're also having to fight the Congress, and we don't live in Utah. So how do you have any thoughts about how to deal with that real threat that can keep us from doing the things that you're talking about doing in DC?
You know, it's not the kind of, because I work at the national level, it's not the kind of thing I think of a lot, but because of my work with Ed and just the proximity of a lot of people here and where I work, I pick some of this up in the ether, and my sense, I'm just going to say one thing, because this would be a great question to ask somebody like Ed and others here to hold forth on. My sense is that one of our best one of our best and I think visibly potent forces against that is our own political representation. I see our city council is pushing back very hard against that kind of pressure and of, figuratively bristling at the kind of top-down pressure you're talking about. And I think family and medical leave is a good example. I mean, not only was the political institutions, of course, the federal institutions, of course, hostile to that or the minimum wage or any of the kick-ass agenda I've mentioned, but the Washington Post was editorializing against it. And what I think our team needs to do is both empower and insist that our council represent these voices, our voices, but also continue to work on both the factual and the advocacy campaign to make our case in the context of inequality, of wage stagnation, of environmental shortfalls. This gets to my fundamental point. We have the agenda that will actually help the people that sent Trump to Washington. They don't. We do. And our goal has to be to make that undeniably clear to everyone.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Joanna with the DC Paid Family Leave Campaign. Thank you for your support. And I think to actually follow up on the previous question, our mayor has said that she would very much like to veto this bill to stop it from going forward because it doesn't do enough to help DC residents or because now is not the right time. And I guess I'm curious your take on what this means politically, economically for DC, how we can push back on that kind of thinking, and making sure that DC is representing a bold, progressive, kick-ass agenda and not cowering under pressure.
I'm glad you're all adopting my terminology. Well, I mean, Ed and I wrote a piece and ran in the Washington Post, which I'm sure you know, where we tried to make the economics argument, and I think that's the best argument. I think I don't know, I can't say I understand the mayor's opposition, but I think it comes from the idea that, oh no, another mandate on business, and that's going to hurt the economy. And frankly, I think mayors and governors, unlike some of our federal politicians, they really do have to answer to the business community, and I'm sympathetic to that. But I think what you have to do is look at the evidence, look at the empirics, and figure out whether an idea like this or the minimum wage is likely to have the kinds of negative economic impacts or unintended consequences that I believe she has in the back of her mind. And I have tried to make strong arguments that it won't. Now, nobody can know what's going to happen until you actually do it. But if your criterion was always, well, I'm too afraid to try anything, then you're never going to try anything. And I think that the rest of the council and the advocacy groups and the majority of people in the city have very much argued, let's try this. And so we should try it. Next.
Hi there, Jesse Lovell with DC for Democracy, Ward 3 Democrats. I wanted to ask about kind of the broader issue, poverty. We have a crisis of affordability pretty much every major city and really even a lot of smaller cities all across the country now. And especially an increase in a very large population, extremely low income populations, homelessness. I mean, we're seeing a lot of cities recording some of their highest ever levels of homelessness. And I'm just wondering, in looking at different cities around the country, if you see in broad terms, what 2 or 3. You could sort of say macro at the micro level policies that work better in trying to relieve some of this pressure and some of this growth, and some that really don't. I was just interested in your thoughts.
That's a great question, and is that we can make that our last question? Yeah, that's our last, and it's a great question to end on. Because what your question makes me think of is not, I'll try to speak, I will speak to the narrow part, because it's actually what I think about a lot. For all the stuff I've been talking about today, the agenda that I kind of love the most, the one that I'm most drawn toward, is precisely this. How can we get the macroeconomy working in such a way that it's not just, GDP is up and everybody else is down, or productivity is up, or industrial production up, or inflation is level, or the unemployment rate is nice and low, but, the economy's doing fine except for most of the people in it. That ain't right. And so what is the policy architecture? What's the connective tissue that we must build to reconnect a growing economy, which, by the way, we have? I mean, you can complain about the growth rate, but we're doing better than any other advanced economy, and the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates because they think the economy is getting too hot. I think it's a mistake, but they're actually meeting, is it this week? So I think a lot about this and how you, and there are a couple of policies that are key. The most important is full employment. And this is the idea that not just a 4.7 unemployment rate, which is the unemployment rate for the nation, DC is higher than that, I believe, but an unemployment rate that is low enough to generate the kind of wage pressures that we haven't seen nearly enough of for middle and low wage workers. I use the word power in the context of my talk. And here, in this context, bargaining power is what matters. And when the unemployment rate gets really low and stays really low, middle and particularly low-wage workers, because they benefit the most, so this is a poverty solution, low-wage workers have the bargaining power they don't typically have in an economy that's not at full employment. At a full employment economy, employers have to bid up the wages and the compensation of low-wage workers in order to get and keep the workers they need to meet consumer demand. So we have to have a full employment economy, and that means lots of jobs. So for people who don't have them, or better jobs for people who have them, or jobs with more hours for people who want more hours, because there's a large number of people who are involuntarily part-time workers still. And, that raises the question of how do you get there, and that's a whole nother talk, and I'm not going to do that now because we have to move on. My work, by the way, in fact, I have a book called The Reconnection Agenda, which explains all of this. But one thing I will leave you with, because I said that I think we need a really robust, compelling agenda that appeals to people, appeals to the electorate next time they have a chance to express what I predict will be their great dissatisfaction at the way the Trump administration has not helped uplift them the way he promised it would. But we need something more than Hillary Clinton brought to the table, I think demonstrably. And in this context, we've got to get to full employment. Because full employment, especially, I didn't show this slide, but I have a slide on unions. Unions are way down. And given the fact that unions aren't administering the bargaining clout that they used to, we need something else, and that's really consistently tight labor markets. Well, here's my punchline. And this is what I'm sort of just beginning to work on, and maybe if I see a bunch of heads shake no or yes, it'll inspire me to keep going down this path. So I'm throwing this out. This is like the comedian I saw the other night at the Arlington Draft Day says, I'm going to try some new material on you. So this is me doing that. I think that if the job market doesn't provide ample quality employment for people enough, which we see in cities across this country, we see it in Baltimore, we see it in Washington, we see it in New York, we see it in LA, we see it in Chicago. If the job market, the private market, isn't providing the gainful quality employment opportunities, then the government has a role to do so. So I don't think you should guarantee everybody an income. I'm not there. I think you should guarantee everybody a good job. Okay, well, I'm going to keep working on that. Thank you very much.